Welcome to The Inquisitive Artist. I'm Lindsay Tyson, an abstract artist fascinated by the creative processes and journeys of fellow artists. How do they create? Can they make a living from their art? And what goes on behind the scenes? Join me as we discover the realities of life as an artist and the challenges of thriving in the art world. In this episode, I continue my conversation with artist, curator and collaborator, Court Spencer. Let's talk about your art, and we just touched on it briefly about your project that was it Anastasis?
Anastasis,
at
Left Bank.
So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that came about when I was at Left Bank, and it's run by a Christian charity, and so it was coming up to Easter, and they wanted to have some sort of art installation or exhibition that sort of tied in with Easter. And I'm of no religion, so I was very conscious that I wanted to make sure whatever we did was very accessible, and so, was appealing to those who wanted something about the Easter story, but equally those who weren't necessarily looking at it through that lens could also take something from it. So it wasn't really responding to a brief as such, but, I had something that there was a need there. And so I don't know how I came up with it, but I decided that I wanted to create a piece where I had over 2,500 seedlings.
Was the number...
The number wasn't significant. No. It was probably, budget or, whatever we could afford in terms of, little pots from Wilko's when Wilko's existed. So I worked with a team of volunteers, and I had all these different seedlings. So people came and sort of helped pot all these, like over 2,500 seedlings. And then people sort of took them home or to their greenhouses or to their sort of, windowsills and sort of helped grow them for me. And then brought them all back. And then, again, another team of volunteers helped sort of arrange them. So we had them in this sort of circle. And it opened for Easter, and then it ran for a week, and it closed on Earth Day. And so I'd worked in collaboration with a sound artist called Bob Birch, who had recorded a dawn chorus. So, the birds sort of, waking up in the morning. And so we ran that alongside it. And so that was just a really nice way of, I suppose it's sort of it put people at ease, if you hear bird songs, I sort of think... I think I was reading something about it that biologically, when the birds are singing, everything's well. But, if the birds stop, you know that they've spotted something and there's sort of danger lurking. And so sort of subconsciously we're put at ease by listening to bird songs. I didn't know that until relatively recently. But I just sort of thought that was a nice sort of it felt like it made for a sort of more tranquil setting. It increased dwell time. People were more likely to spend more time with it. I'd also worked with somebody to write some sort of reflective prompts that, could guide a bit of a self-meditation sort of thing. And we had sofas in there, and, people responded really well to it. They spent a lot of time with it. Some people... wanted to touch all of them. Yeah. And then,
so you said there were different
sort of different seedlings. So I think we had I think it was corn and sunflowers and chives and beans and beetroot and snow peas and stuff. So there was sort of variation, and obviously within the circles it sort of felt life cycles. So it was sort of celebrating. You could interpret it as the Easter story, but equally it could be, celebrating sort of spring and the seasons and life cycles. So it was very broad, so you could read into it what you wanted, really. So that was a really lovely piece to work on.
Do you think of yourself as a conceptual artist? How would you describe your art?
This will sound really stupid because I, obviously work with people that I want them to have their nice, neat elevator pitch, but I don't know. I suppose, it is probably quite conceptual, which...
I suppose you're responding to a place and a a narrative, is it? Or something
Yeah. I suppose that one is a perfect example of me feeling more comfortable with a brief, like my uni sort of experience, because that had a very set time period. I had my venue, I had what I was the messages that I was trying to sort of convey, and even within that, because it started at Easter and finished on Earth Day, we then invited people to come and take the seedlings on Earth Day at the end. So then people took them to their gardens or their allotments and they grew, and logistically it meant that I had nothing to clean up. Bob Birch just had to come and take the speakers down. But other than that, and so, and that sort of perpetuates the whole life cycle thing as well, which is quite nice. So I suppose a brief is sort of helpful for me, because
I suppose it gives you that a starting point and an inspiration to work with.
I sort of feel like if the world is your oyster, that's kind of overwhelming, and then I sort of get almost paralyzed, where there's just too much, you're sort of slightly overwhelmed and there's so much scope, and then I end up doing nothing.
So I've noticed that when you do your art, you quite often use different mediums and different disciplines, and so you use lots of different... And is that just responding to the brief, or...
I suppose I'm sort of thinking about, like, in that case, what felt right. So it's quite sort of instinctive in a way.
Because you wouldn't classify yourself as a painter?
No. When people say, what do you do? I sort of generally say I make a mess. And so that sort of shuts that conversation down quite quickly. Or at the moment I'll say I rub dirt into paper. And again, nobody knows how to respond to that. So then that conversation just stops quite quickly.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about that, because you did a project where you went back to Australia, and was it you visited all the areas you went, because you moved around? Well, you talk about it. Easier.
So this was my returning project. So at the back end of 2019, I wanted to revisit the 5 different places that I'd gone to primary school. So with my dad's job, he worked for the Bureau of Meteorology, so we moved a lot. So as I said, I went to 5 different primary schools. Wow. And so most of these places I'd never been back to. So I was, about to turn 40, and it just felt right to, go back and sort of experience them as an adult and sort of see them through an adult lens. And so, I hadn't thought about it as a brief, but I suppose I had probably given myself a bit of a brief, in that I was going for a fixed period of time. It was an 8-week research project. I wanted to spend a week in each place for every year that we had lived there. So the first place I went to was the Cocos-Keeling Islands, where I'd done year 1 and year 2. And so I had 2 weeks there. And then I went to Perth for a week. And then I went to Meekatharra, which is sort of almost in the desert, sort of in the outback, about sort of 7.5 hour drive north of Perth. I had 2 weeks there, and then I had a week in Forest, which is on the Nullarbor Plain, which is a very isolated place where only 2 people live, and it was very difficult to get out to. And then a week in Esperance, which is where my parents were still living, which is where I'd sort of done year 7 and all of high school. So I kind of I'd not given myself any sort of prescriptive sort of idea as to what I was going to make or do. I just wanted to go out and experience these places, and I ended up collecting about 120 kilos worth of stuff, like materials and dirt and rocks and sort of found objects, and shipping them back to my studio in the UK.
And there was no, because obviously you couldn't do it from England to Australia. You can't ship, or even you couldn't even take it with you, could you? A bit of dust from England or anything like that.
No, Australia's not so welcoming to things like that.
No, I remember, when you get off the plane, they spray the planes and, so you defungify you. But
coming the other way, I'm fine.
Yeah, no problems at all. You can have anything. Yeah.
Because most of the time when I go to Australia, I will bring back sort of like sand or dirt or something, and I'm like always ready for it. You know, like I've got like this pristine white sand in like these Ziploc bags, and I'm like, yeah, you know, like let's go, let's get that sniffer dog on it. But obviously the sniffer dog's gone over it and it's nothing, and you know, I'm ready with my spiel that it's for an art project, it's a high silica content sand, you know, from Esperance, but no, I never get stopped. I've never got asked. Yeah. Actually, in saying that, the only thing that I've ever got taken off me was a few weeks ago when I was in Malaysia, and I was bringing back some materials, and I hadn't packed this big rock in my in the check-in luggage, and so I just put it in my hand luggage. And when I was going through the security thing, they were like, have you got something big in that backpack? And I was like, my rock? And they were like, oh, we're gonna have to have a look at that. And so like I pull my rock out, and he's like, yeah, I'm sorry. I was like, I'm gonna have to leave my rock here. He was like, yeah. I was like, okay. My boyfriend jumping for joy because it weighed a ton, and he was like, oh, that's a weight off my mind. And then the guy goes, hang on, have you got a second one in there? I was like, that's my sand, you can't have that. I got that from the Black Sand Bay. And he was like, okay, you can keep that. So yeah, I'm used to sort of like bringing stuff.
So what is it about the, you know, the sand and the mud and the rocks?
I don't know, sort of like thinking back, because we moved a lot, and I was in sort of like quite remote, rural sort of settings. You know, like one place we lived in Forest, it was, you know, like there were only a few other families that lived there. There was no school. I had to do School of the Air, which is, you know, like the flying doctor service, you know, that you guys might have got in the 80s or 90s. Well, it's kind of like the school version of that. So you're on like a two-way radio for half an hour a day. And other than that, it was like via correspondence. And, you know, there was no shop. There was a train that used to go through once a week that you called the Tea and Sugar train that had a shop on it. And that's where you get like your groceries and stuff. So, you know, like I wasn't sort of going to sort of ballet classes during that year. I wasn't sort of, you know, there wasn't sort of brownies to be attending and things like that. You were sort of knocking about in the sort of like the dirt making, you know, like cubbies and, you know, like, well, you guys call them dens, I think, over here. But, you know, you were making your own fun as a kid. But that was sort of using very, shall we say, modest materials. So maybe it comes from that.
Childhood, I mean, obviously your project is about that, but obviously you do it as a regular thing.
Yeah.
So it's something in you that makes you want to
Yeah, maybe. And it's sort of, it's a way of maybe connecting to that, but it also becomes kind of a bit meditative, you know, like if I'm, say, like rubbing dirt into paper, you know, it's just that over and over. There's something that becomes quite sort of meditative. I remember
seeing in your house you'd used a red ochre or something like that
that
you'd picked up in Australia, and it was like, you know, the Eve Klein blue, but it was a natural colour, and it was absolutely beautiful. It had this glow. It was just a plain pit, and
that was only that's literally one coat, and so that's got a really interesting story to it. And so that sort of, you know, like was sort of like decades in the making in a weird way. Well, like a lot more than that if you think in geological terms. But so when I was probably about 10, I went on this picnic, and I don't remember a great deal about the picnic other than we found a dead kangaroo hanging in a tree. So that's like the bit that's burnt in my memory. And then years later, I'm sort of in my mid-30s, and I was on holiday with my dad, and we ended up catching up with one of his colleagues. And we were talking about art and my art, and the colleague had said, do you remember that picnic spot that we went to? He was like, there's apparently an ochre mine not far from there. Right. And I was like, oh, interesting. Yeah, I'll look that up. And so I looked it up, and it's this sacred Aboriginal site where they've been extracting ochre for over 27,000 years. It could possibly be the world's longest continuously used mining site in the world. So when I'd looked it up, you had to be like an initiated Aboriginal male to go. And I sort of thought, well, no chance, I'm not getting in. But then when I was doing this returning project, I was like, do you know what? I want to see how I would go about getting permission to go out there, if that's even a thing, or if maybe I could get some ochre from there. You know, I just wanted to talk to somebody. So I did some digging, rang around a few places, and the council put me in touch with one of the Aboriginal elders. So I drove up to his workplace and I felt really awkward. And so I just did one extra lap of the block before I parked. And then I went in, and it's just like, this office, a receptionist sat at the desk, and I asked for him. He wasn't there. She'd left a message on his phone. And then I was explaining, I used to live here, I'm about to turn 40. And then there was this one other girl in that place, other than the receptionist, this girl behind me in the queue. And she piped up and she said, "Did you say you turned 40 this year?" I was like, "Yeah." She said, and we were just like, we went to school together.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. She's like, "I'll take you there." So she ended up taking me to meet this Aboriginal elder, and he was lovely. And so I ended up spending a couple of hours with him and his wife. They were artists themselves, and so they showed me their work. We sort of chatted about all the sort of like the Aboriginal words that I could remember from school, and all the people that used to live there, and some of them still lived in town. And I got to ask like all sorts of like questions about their culture, and they sort of just explained loads of things, and they were just very sharing and like looking things up on YouTube to show me. And they were just really welcoming. And so they'd said that I could go out to the site, and so they arranged for their nephew to take me out a few days later, and it also said, and get some ochre for me because I want to make a painting. And and we've kept in touch, and I hope to work with him again in the future. There's sort of projects that we'd both like to do, sort of something
in Australia.
He's got something in Australia that he wants us to do, and I've got things over here that I want us to do. But if I hadn't have done that extra lap around the block, I would never have met my former sort of classmate. And
why wasn't he in his office? It
didn't matter because I got taken to him sort of 10 minutes later, which was brilliant. So like when you were saying before, stars aligning, synchronicity, I think that definitely plays a part.
So where all the different places you went, you got materials from each place, and then you brought them back, and then
so then I sort of started working with them in the studio. And so granted, when I collected the rocks, the sand, the stick, I didn't know what they were going to become. I didn't know that I was like rubbing dirt into paper.
So was that an instinct? It's like an intuitive thing, I need to collect these things?
It was just things that I gravitated towards. And so I would do things. I suppose I was at that point of my life where some people might say midlife crisis, and I'll be like, what's a midlife crisis other than somebody just, reflecting on the trajectory of their life and changing it. So I suppose, looking back as like a little kid, you're quite instinctive as a little kid. You maybe did what your parents told you, what your teachers told you, but other than that, you was kind of like, you're quite
especially when you had that much freedom.
Actually, I had a lot of freedom as a child. And so, you'd run around and you'd just instinctively be, drawn to certain things. And so I think I sort of tried to get back in that sort of like headspace a bit. So like at Cocos, I'd be cycling around the island in my pajamas and just putting things that I found into my little basket. Or I'd leave them on the side of the road and think, I'll wait until I've got the car and I'll come back for that because it's too heavy for my bike. And, the guy that I was staying with, he would know which beach I would be at. And some days he would just drive along and come and find me. And I've sort of found this like massive piece of like sea rope that's washed up, that's all tangled around a piece of wood, and I'm like trying to undo it, and he'd come with a knife and help me with it. And in Meekatharra, I'd drive around and I wouldn't really know where I was going. I just have this vague recollection of like the Granites being a picnic spot near town that we used to go to when I was little, and I thought it was down this road. And so I'd just venture off and sort of find these places, or all of a sudden I'd sort of see a pile of sort of dirt on the side of the road that I liked. So I always had my little Ziploc bags and I'd had my sieve, and I'd sort of say, I will have some of that, thank you. And
so have you actually utilised much of it?
not all of it, so
Yeah.
I've still got lots to play with, but that's the thing, it's sort of weird that all of a sudden when you bring it over here, you know, if you've got a beach full of sand, well, that feels like limitless, doesn't it? But then when you've got, you know, your sort of 3 kilos or whatever you've brought over, all of a sudden that feels really precious.
Yeah.
So then you're like, you know, really, you know, you're sort of like, you want to be careful with how you use it, but then that takes away the playful element as
Yeah.
well. So it's sort of a bit of a balance to be had. But yeah, I've started making sort of like assemblages and some drawings and rubbings. And yeah, the dirt rubbing series is something that I really am quite drawn to, in that years ago, I always wanted to, well, I thought it was going to be a painting. You know, when if you fly over Australia, you're looking down on a red landscape and it just goes for hours and hours and hours. And I kind of wanted to capture that somehow, but like, I'm not a painter, but when I tried to paint it, it just didn't really work. And then I was trying to get texture in it and it just felt fake and forced and it just didn't feel right. So fast forward sort of decades, and I've got this sort of, you know, like Wilgie Meyer red ochre. And all of a sudden I'm sort of thinking about it and I'm like, well, I want to do a landscape, you know, I want to sort of present the landscape, but this stuff in this bag is the landscape.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of Australia in this bag. And so by putting it on a watercolour piece of paper that's sort of landscape,
Yeah.
and just rubbing
Yeah.
the ochre on it, it's presenting it as a landscape, and it is very much of the land. And so that felt
And the
right.
colour is quite incredible.
The colour is, yeah. And I find that really interesting. So like when we were at Manchester Art Fair, you know, it's so interesting listening to people's feedback. So some people just beelined to it and just loved it and just gravitated towards it and just, I don't know what they were getting out of it because they didn't know the story or anything behind it, but it just sort of spoke to them, which is great.
But it does sort of glow.
It's got a real sense of luminosity to it. And as I said, it's literally
richness.
dry and it's just one coat, and then I've used some sort of spray fixative, sorry. But yeah, then other people would sort of like look at it and just sort of like go, it's beyond me, and walk off. And I'd sort of think, fair play. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. And I had somebody, when I was showing that piece at First White Cloth Hall, and she said, oh, you know, like she made a comment on the price and I don't see it. And I said, that's okay, but I'll tell you a little bit more about it and then you might see it. And then I sort of explained it to her. And she was like, wow, that totally changes the way I see that.
It's amazing how a little bit of the background or something
Story,
can totally change your
Your
the way you
perception.
perceive it, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's happened to me on quite a lot of occasions when I've thought, oh God, what's that? And then you've read about it and actually you get this connection with it, don't you? That you think, God, yeah, actually, that's quite clever.
But you know what? I would love to have spoken to some of the people, if I'd had a chance, that really beelined to it, because you know what
is it
what's drawn them to it, because what's their connection to it? I know my connection to it, but it's very different to whatever they've got. So yeah, it is so interesting.
I found it really, you know, because it is basically a piece of red paper, I suppose. But there was something really fascinating about it, and that drew you in. You could almost feel the energy of it.
Oh, that's nice.
It was,
I think some people get annoyed that I call it dirt rubbing series and they're like that I'm belittling it, and I certainly don't mean to belittle it at all, but I feel like for me it's sort of talking about my childhood. And so when you're a kid, you know, it's not just the ochre that I'm working with in that series either. Sometimes it's literally dirt off the side of the road that I've just pulled the car over and got my little sort of shovel out and my Ziploc bags. So it is sort of, you know, as a kid, that was dirt, you know. And so, I don't mean to belittle anything, but I sort of think the way I'm using it and the way I present it hopefully shows that, you know, I do
and I suppose
it's quite precious.
what I find fascinating is that you can have a plain piece of paper effectively, but it still can be really interesting. You don't need marks and detail and texture like you were saying. It didn't feel right when you were doing it, but so you don't need that, do you, to create something?
Not always, no.
Yeah.
And I also sort of think, you know, like art is only half of it. You know, like the viewer brings the other half in a way, don't they? Because it's sort of quite reflective of what they're going to bring to the reading of the work.
Yeah. Well, I think, you see, I'm pretty guilty of it sometimes. You know, can very quickly dismiss something or walk past
Oh,
it
so do I, don't worry.
and not really think anything of it. But then when you do know the story behind it, or you look a bit deeper, because I have a tendency to just, don't like, you know, it grabs me or it doesn't.
Yeah.
I do think I should take longer looking at things sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. But I think I'm guilty of that too. I think everybody is, because, you know, we are in a sort of, you know, visually saturated world, aren't we? And so, you know, there is a sort of sense of fatigue sometimes. But, you know, people do... Sometimes it's not about the work, it's about you, isn't it? So, like, I might sort of gloss straight over something, but then 6 months later, I might be enthralled by that same piece. But that might be because I have had a different experience. I am now a different person. And all of a sudden, that piece of art means so much more to me, and I'm connecting with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree
and so
with
also,
that.
I sort of feel like sometimes artists can take things really personally, that somebody hasn't connected with their work. And I'm like, that's not saying anything about your work. It's saying something about them. And, you know, it's just not quite the right connection. Exactly. You know, you don't like
You're
everything you see.
You're not friends with everybody, are you?
Exactly. And you don't like everything that you see in a gallery. And so, you know, it's just about finding your right people, your right audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to ask you about your work and exhibitions that you create. Do you actually put your own work in? Obviously you did with the, I can't remember that word.
Anastasis. That's a Greek word.
Anastasis,
I didn't actually come up with it. It was the person I was working with who did the reflections, the sort of prompts. But it's an ancient Greek word for resurrection. Right. So tying in with like the Easter thing. So that sort of.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you how often you put your own work in, or do you know?
Well, like at Left Bank, that was like, I think that was the main piece of work that I ever did for Left Bank, in terms of my own work. But yeah, I sort of think because of that, I was very mindful that I had worked in that beautiful space for 5 years and really only ever got my work in there once. But then there's sort of that tension that if you're working as a curator, you don't want to be just pushing your work the whole time, and I think that'd be quite boring, really. And I'm much more excited by other people's work sometimes. So yeah, I have tried to start sort of, you know, incorporating my work occasionally into things. But yeah, I definitely sort of skew it. But even, you know, my time, it's primarily curating. Yeah. I don't actually spend very much time making my own work. So even if I sort of thought, hey, I'll have my own exhibition, that would be a lot of time in the making for me to actually make work for that exhibition.
Would you ever enter open exhibitions or anything like that? Do you ever consider doing that?
I haven't. It's probably something that I should do, because in terms of like, as an artist, I don't sort of push myself or my own practice as
much as I should. Why do you think that is?
I think it goes back to that sort of overwhelm thing. You know, it's very easy for me to focus my time and attention on sort of curating and sort of work-related stuff because I've got this nice, neat list of like to do, and I feel like I've never done enough. There's always more that I could do, and that's really actionable. You know, they're like very sort of logistical, like rewriting the website, doing more social media posts, focusing on press releases and sort of, they're things that I can tick off my list. Whereas if I've just got, you know, make art, well, that's huge, and that I need to sort of chunk that down. And I think I probably work better when I get to totally immerse myself in something. So I love having a project that I'm sort of like completely absorbed in.
I was actually meant to ask you, with your, was it 8 weeks your project in Australia? Yeah. Was that self-funded, or did you manage to get an Arts Council grant or anything?
No, that was self-funded. So I
So actually taking 8 weeks off to do that was quite a big.
Well, that was Well, I didn't have time to apply for funding because it all sort of happened quite quickly, because I had decided to leave Left Bank which would then mean that I could take 8 weeks off.
Right.
So this was like prime time for me to...
Before your next job.
Yeah.
Right.
So this was, like I had this window of opportunity. So that made complete sense. And also in terms of timing, I was so bloody lucky because I flew out on Christmas Day 2019. So I got out to Cocos Island on the day after Boxing Day, I think. Yeah. And I did my 8 weeks. And then as I was flying back out, I saw all these flight attendants wearing masks, and I was like, what's that all about? And I was like, weird. And then, like you'd heard about, like COVID-19 or something, but I didn't think a great deal to it. Flew back, started working with Leeds Museums and Galleries, and within 3 weeks, we were in lockdown. Right, yeah. So if I hadn't have gone then, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
Okay, so I always finish with the question, but I think for you it might be two because you're a curator and an artist.
Okay.
So my last question is always, do you have any advice for other artists? So maybe from both perspectives.
Yep. Yeah, I think, well, going back to, you'd mentioned networks, I think networks are really important. I think trying to be the sort of person that other people want to work with is useful. Yeah. Being supportive of others, going to other people's exhibition openings, sharing their things on social media, and just generally being a nice person. Yeah. And like I sort of think, finding your network, finding your tribe, finding the people who click with you, that bring out the best in you and that you want to work with, and that you feel that you can work well with. Yeah. Because like collaboration is hugely important. Like. Nothing I could do by myself. It's always in collaboration with other people.
Have you got anything coming up that we need to know about?
Yep. So with the Art Court, we've got Phil Hopkins has got an online exhibition. So that's available on the website. So it's works on paper.
I'll put those in the show notes.
Excellent. Yeah. That's his works on paper, a selection of works from his Walking Ahead series, which is something that he began during lockdown. And then we've also got an exhibition called Equilibrium by the Harrogate-based artist Julia Poulton, and so that's in at iRoom. Right. And then also we'll have the Leeds Summer Group show coming up. I need to confirm some dates for that, but that will be available via my Court Spencer Instagram and also Curator Space. Right.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming, Court, especially for making the effort to come to Scarborough.
Oh, no, it's lovely to be here. And a blue sky and seaside. Yeah. And you. We can't ask for more.
No, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And that's a wrap on my conversation with Court Spencer. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment or share. It really helps get the word out and grow the community. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.